All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Gretchen Hockmeister, the Executive Director of the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon, and we're very happy to have you here with us tonight for the latest installment in our virtual book signing series. Just a few housekeeping items first. We all know how Zoom works by now, but just to remind you to please mute yourself now during Richard's presentation and discussion with Brian. We will then open the floor for Q&A and discussion. You may either type your questions in the chat box and we can read them to Richard later on, or you may raise your hand either virtually or for real. You can raise your real hands and we will call on you. We encourage you to turn your camera on throughout the evening so it feels like we are all actually gathered together in the library for a nice meeting. Our program will be moderated this evening by the library's own Brian Ross, investigative journalist with the Law and Crime Network. Brian will introduce Richard. So thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you, Holly Nelson, as well, for putting together this series of great events with authors who we cannot see in person, but we're very pleased to have them online with us. And tonight, a real treat. Richard Lazarus, a professor of law at Harvard University, in fact, the Howard and Catherine Abel Professor of Law at Harvard University. He teaches environmental law and Supreme Court advocacy. He has been an advisor to the Biden transition team, very much involved. He's represented state and local governments and environmental groups 40 times before the United States Supreme Court. So he knows what he's talking about, that's for sure. And he's written an amazing book. Richard, if there were a couple of murders in here and some naked swimming pool scenes, it could be a John Grisham novel. Really is a gripping book, a fantastic read, very hard to put it down. It is called The Rule of Five, Making Climate History at the Supreme Court, a fantastic book, a detailed and gripping description of how one case made its way from a small town all the way to the court and really changed history. Richard, thank you so much for being here and give us an idea about the book.
Yeah, happy to do that, Brian. I'm going to share a screen, so it's just going to take, bear with me for just a second while I get my screen up here. Everyone can see it?
Yep.
Great, thanks a lot. Well, I'm delighted to participate in this event hosted by the Hotchkiss Library. I want to give special thanks, invitation to Holly, Gretchen, of course, Brian, and it's a real treat for me also to have some very good friends here. That's Steve and Rhonda. That's a treat. I was hoping they would show up, and so it's great to see them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my recently published book. It's called The Rule of Five, as Brian said, Making Climate History at the Supreme Court. I'm going to take no more than 15 minutes to describe two things, and then I look forward to questions from Brian and from everyone here. First, I want to describe the arc of the story and then my overall goal in writing the book. And then second, I want to highlight parts of the book, provide you the sense of the book's voice and what makes the story so engaging. And I'm just going to go through sort of the chapters and show you what's there. So first, the story's arc and its primary objective. It's divided into 20 chapters, followed by an epilogue. You'll see that chapter 3 is called A Turd. You can ask me about that later. I can tell you that my wife, when she saw me working on this years ago, and she walked by and she saw a chapter called A Turd, she said, "You are not going to publish a book with a chapter called A Turd." I did anyway, and we are very happily married still. So the story's arc, it literally begins with a guy named Joe, and the story ends with the Supreme Court ruling that made history. The most important environmental law case ever decided by the Supreme Court. It's called Massachusetts versus EPA, often referred to as environmental laws, Brown v. Board of Education. A case which not only transformed US climate change law, but had worldwide impact. It did no less than lead to the historic Paris Accord in December 2015. Would not have happened without the Supreme Court ruling. So my primary objectives in writing this book were twofold. First, I want to write a book for a popular audience that revealed what makes Supreme Court advocacy so challenging and so fascinating. And from both sides of the lectern, where the advocates stand to argue before the court, and then the other side, within the court itself. I wanted to open a window, really, let the general public see inside the extraordinary amount of maneuvering, strategy, conflict the personal and professional drama in a case, and not from bad motives. It happens because the stakes in the Supreme Court are so high. And when the stakes are so high, emotions run high and conflicts quickly follow. I also want to write a book for a general audience that revealed what has made it so difficult for our country to address the climate change issue, why it's proven so hard, often for reasons that many people don't know, and why for that reason this case is so important. There's no more important environmental issue facing the world right now than climate change. And as the coronavirus has underscored for all of us, there's no escaping the need for global cooperation for these kinds of global threats. All right, so here are a few highlights from the book, just illustrative parts of the story. Chapter 1, of course, it's October 1999. Joe Mendelsohn pulls his desk drawer open. He reaches inside. The several hundred-page petition he drafted more than a year ago is still there, as he knew it would be. For all these months, the decision to file or not had weighed on it. It's a classic late October autumn day in the nation's capital, low 50s, sunny with a sporadic light drizzle. This was not just any day. It was a day Joe Mendelsohn edged himself to the point of acting. And he pulled out the petition. He walked down to EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and he hand-delivered the petition he had been working on. He demanded that the Clinton EPA regulate greenhouse gas emissions for motor vehicles. So who was Joe Mendelsohn? He was a young public interest lawyer, graduated from law school, GW, just a few years before. He worked for a public interest organization no one had ever heard of, the Center for Technology Assessment. They had a total of 5 employees. I think 2 were full-time, 3 were part-time. They worked paycheck to paycheck and more often no paycheck at all. And Joe worked very much alone. He worked on the petition late at night by his daughter's crib. None of the powerful national environmental groups, NRDC, Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, Earth Justice, no one supported it. They actively opposed his filing the petition. They thought it was a terrible mistake to file it. And one of them even tried at one point to cut off his funding if he was going to push this litigation. So you fast forward now to chapter 10. At this point, they had lost their case in the lower court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. They lost there by a vote of 2-1, and Joe's no longer alone. At this point, it's the Bush administration, and there are hundreds of lawyers have joined Joe, from the leading environmental groups across the country in a dozen states as well. But when they lost that first round in the lower court, there was only one attorney out of those hundreds who thought they should seek further review in the Supreme Court. Everyone else said, terrible idea. We risk a major loss. Let's wait for another day and another case. Let's not take it up any further. The only person really who felt differently was this guy, Jim Milkey. Jim Milkey headed the environmental office in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. And he thought they should take a chance. He said, what's the point? Let's not surrender. Let's take a chance and seek Supreme Court review. And the pressure on him was enormous. The head of the Natural Resource Defense Council, a fabulous person, wonderful, Francis Beinecke, called him up on the phone, called his boss up on the phone and said, the future of the environmental movement is on your head if you take this case any further. And she had reason to be worried. But Jim said, I'm sorry, we're taking it forward. We're going to keep going. Everyone had to then join him because they want to control him. But the fact is, it was Milkey who decided, just the way it was Mendelsohn alone in the beginning. The court grants review in the case, and that beside was a shock. When the court granted review, it was the first time in 35 years that the Supreme Court had granted review in an environmental case on behalf of the environmentalists over the federal government's objection. It was an amazing grant. As soon as they granted review, though, they filed the briefs, and then they had one of several conflicts. And Steve Vermeil, who's on the Zoom, will know, when a case comes before the Supreme Court, everyone agrees on one thing. The best lawyer should give the argument. But then they have agreements about who the best lawyer is. And this is a case which had dozens of parties all represented. And many people battle over who should be the lawyer presents argument. Supreme Court only allows one per side to do it. So only one was going to be allowed to do it. And it came down to two people, both good faith to make a good argument. They should make the argument. But someone had to win and someone had to lose. And finally, the Massachusetts AG representative, Jim Milkey, he won that battle. But the battle was so intense, and these things happen, but this is intense and destructive I've ever seen. So destructive that these people were good friends. And this was in October 2006. And these attorneys are still not speaking to each other. And we're talking about 15 years later. The book then goes on to talk about the argument before the Supreme Court itself. And these chapters are designed to give the reader a sense of, one, the stunning physical setting of the room, the extraordinary give and take between the justices and the advocates. And the advocates, the challenge they face. The norm these days is for an advocate to be interrupted with questions 50 to 75 times in 30 minutes. I'm not talking about the telephonic stuff right now. Hopefully that'll just be a blip in the court's history. But when they do actual arguments before the court with the justices all there, that's not much time. The justice take up your 30 minutes with your questions. You've got to be on your toes. And the justice's questions are the lawyer's equivalent of trying to hit a Major League Baseball pitch. I mean, it's very tough going. Chapters 17 and 18 then switch the book's perspective from one side of the lectern to the other side of the lectern. And that's where the advocates argue on one, and now we're on the other side, behind the big red curtains in the courtroom, where the justices have their chambers and where the conference room is. This is the court's conference room. This is where they met 2 days after the argument in Massachusetts versus the EPA to decide the case. They sit in a particular order around the room with the Chief Justice, the most senior at one end, Justice John Paul Stevens, the most senior next on the other end, and then around in the order, Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, Souter, Ginsburg, Breyer. At that point, Justice Alito was the junior justice, which means he answers the door if anyone knocks on it and has to be let in at all. And they vote by seniority, starting with the Chief Justice around the room. They met that morning. They did their votes, going around the room. Everyone's waiting for Justice Kennedy because they know Justice Kennedy is likely to decisive vote in this case. And it is 5-4. 5-4 for Massachusetts. But that's just a preliminary vote. Then the challenge is who's going to write the opinion and how can they keep those 5 votes intact? Because justices change their minds all the time. In fact, Justice Kennedy is notoriously known for changing his mind in cases as well. Justice John Paul Stevens is the senior justice of the majority. He has a decision to make, who to assign the opinion to. He could assign it to himself, which is obvious thing to do. It's a big case, an important case. On the other hand, he knows he's got to keep Justice Kennedy's vote. And the best way to keep Justice Kennedy's vote is assign the opinion to Justice Kennedy. Because then you know he's more likely to write in a way that he'll agree with and he'll feel possession of it if you give it to him. On the other hand, he might write a more narrow opinion than Justice Stevens might want. So Justice Stevens decides ultimately to assign it to himself, remembering though cases which people had lost Kennedy's vote when they did that. So Justice Stevens assigns it to himself. I refer to as the bow tie Jedi Master. Justice Stevens' job is to write an opinion which is sweeping in ways he wants it to be. He feels very strongly about this case. He's a Republican and he's frustrated Republicans are not taking the climate change issue seriously. He told me when I met with him in Florida that he wanted this to be an opinion read not just by lawyers, but by the American people. He wanted to send a message about the importance of climate change, but he had to keep Kennedy's vote. It took him 8 drafts to get Kennedy's vote. Draft 1, he had 4 votes. Draft 2, he had 4 votes. Draft 3, they're starting to compromise. He's trying to make compromise to get Kennedy there. He makes so many compromises at one point that Justice Souter decides to circulate a separate concurring opinion, which Justice Ginsburg joins. But then he managed to get Kennedy on with draft 8. Souter withdraws his separate opinion. So it ends up a clean 5-4. The decision comes down on April 2nd, 2007, but it's Barack Obama when he becomes president on January 20th, 2009. He takes this case and they run with it. They try to get legislation. They can't do that through Congress. And everything that Obama does for 8 years is based on Massachusetts free CPA on climate change. And they make history. They produce so many rules and regulations. They form the basis and the foundation for the US to go to Paris and convince the rest of the world to join the US in addressing the climate issue. When I first was researching this book, I thought that was the end of the book. I started researching in 2015. I didn't anticipate, maybe you did, I didn't then anticipate in 2015 the election of 2016 and who the president would be. So the epilogue of the book deals with how do you sort of understand the legacy of this case in light of the presidential election of 2016 and Donald Trump's time after. I make it the epilogue because I don't want that election to sort of overwhelm the significance and history of this case and the job the lawyers did, but I also want to place the Trump administration in perspective. I'm happy to say I have a paperback version coming out in a few months, and I've added the Biden administration to that as well. Thanks a lot.
So Richard, let me start by asking you, I have to ask you this, why the title for chapter 3?
Well, a turd. And that's for this reason. When Joe Mendelsohn filed his petition with the Clinton administration, they just ignored it. They decided we're not going to do anything with this. They didn't want to regulate greenhouse gases in the Clinton administration because they were worried it would hurt Al Gore's chances in the 2000 election. So they wanted to lay off of it. But when Gore lost and Bush won, they put out a notice about the petition right before they left in January 2001. They put out a notice to basically require to sort of make it so that Bush administration had to do something with it. And they said, we're laying a turd on the doorstep of the next administration. And what's interesting about it is the Bush administration, there's no better way to describe it, they stepped on it. They could have themselves had done a lot to ignore it. And probably this case would never have happened. But they took the bait, although you don't think of turds as bait. They took it, they stepped on it. If they hadn't, I think there would have been no case. But they stepped on it and it led to this extraordinary ruling.
You described with great drama how sort of by the skin of their teeth they got the court to accept this. Give us a sense of what was at stake and how did they get in there? Because they were afraid they didn't have what's called standing.
Yeah, well, they were afraid they didn't have standing. That's once the court took it. They thought they could lose on whether they had jurisdiction in Article 3 of the Constitution. The Constitution provides federal courts, including the Supreme Court, with jurisdiction only if there's a case or controversy. That's all the Constitution says. But the Supreme Court, over decades, has fleshed out a test for whether or not you have Article 3 standing. And that's, you have to show to Article 3 standing, you have a concrete imminent injury, that there's a causal nexus between your injury and what you're challenging for the government, and that the court can redress it. When applied to climate change, that actually is tough. That's a stretch. Because climate change, the cause and effect are spread out over time and space. You have actions at one point which have consequences not a year later, not a day later, but 100 years later. You have actions in one place that have consequences not right next to you, but thousands of miles away in other parts of the world, the way climate change works. So the climate change cause and effect doesn't fit the notion of concreteness, doesn't fit the notion of imminence. It's very hard to show the reduced motor vehicle emissions from new cars, US. That's kind of a perceptible effect on any particular thing or place in the United States, because global way climate change works. It doesn't matter where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. If they come from India or China or Africa or South America, they have the same impact on climate change as if they come from anywhere in the United States. So it doesn't fit. It was going to be a very close issue. And that's why a lot of people said, don't take it to the court. Because if we lose on Article 3 standing, it's game over. There'll be no more climate change cases in the federal court. They got in, they briefed it really well, and then Justice Kennedy swung over, and that was the crucial moment.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the argument was that the sort of the coastline of Massachusetts was being eaten away. Was that essentially the argument?
Yeah.
Which wasn't their first and strongest argument, was it?
Yeah. Well, what happened is a couple of things. One is they were smart to have Massachusetts argue the case, have a state be the face before the Supreme Court, and not have an environmental group be the face. And they did that purposely. That's why the case is called Massachusetts versus EPA, because they knew that the Supreme Court and the justices are more respectful and deferential to states than they are to environmental groups. And Justice Kennedy himself is very deferential and respectful of states. So that's why they put the state name first, and they put a state person in the AG's office arguing. They had many arguments, but Mielke, and actually he decided during the argument itself to some extent to emphasize physical injury to the Massachusetts coastline, to make it as traditional an injury as possible, to appeal to Justice Kennedy.
And that's how they got in there.
And they got his vote. But here's the amazing thing that happened in argument. So in the middle of the argument, Justice Kennedy looks down to Jim Mielke. He says, do you have a case that suggests that states have more right to standing in these kinds of instances than any other plaintiff? And Jim Mielke came up with some kinds of cases. And Kennedy said, well, I think your best case is Georgia v. Tennessee Copper. That was a case from like 1910 in the Supreme Court. There had been about 50 briefs filed in this case. No one had cited Georgia v. Tennessee Copper. Mielke thought to himself, I'm not even sure I know what Georgia v. Tennessee Copper is. But if it's good enough for Justice Kennedy, it's good enough for me. And it was that moment in oral argument that those of us in the audience, we all stood up. Not stood up, that would be in trouble. We bristled up because it showed that Massachusetts was going to win on that standing issue, because Kennedy has done his own research to figure out what he thought the best case was. So at that point, everyone knew the biggest possible loss wasn't going to happen. Now, the irony is there was actually a pretty decent argument for why Kennedy was wrong. There was another case out there that would have argued against that case. But since it had never really been fully briefed by any of the parties, no one knew that then, and it almost became too late to change.
You write in such a tremendous narrative style, reflecting the great research, the reporting you did, really. I was envious as a reporter, like all the great, who talked to you? How many members of the Supreme Court talked to you, and everybody else talked?
I got good access to a lot of people. I talked to 3 justices. I'm not allowed to say, only one I spoke with on the record, and that was Justice Stevens. I'll tell you, was a highlight. I mean, I would have written the book just to spend time down in Fort Lauderdale with Justice Stevens. Just an amazing individual with an extraordinary life. The book is dedicated to Justice Stevens. One of my great hopes dashed was that I had a last meeting with Justice. I was supposed to have a last meeting with Justice Stevens. I think it was on July 30th of 2019 to go out to Fort Lauderdale. I had to delay it a couple of weeks because he was going to Portugal. Now, the guy is like 97 years old, and he's flying off to Portugal. That's the way he led his life. And he passed away right after he got back from Portugal 1 week before our meeting. And my plan was for my own purpose, to read him the chapter on him and tell him I was dedicating the book to him. So that was a personal disappointment to me, but obviously has no impact on the extraordinary life that he led. And he was an amazing person. Let me give you one quick sense. As a young man, he met Amelia Earhart. He went to the baseball game where Babe Ruth did the called home run. He was there for it. He was a private pilot in Florida in his 90s. He went swimming every day in the ocean, and he played tennis. He was a real force and a fabulous justice.
And a bow tie Jedi.
A bow tie Jedi master.
Amazing. And it's also interesting, the personal conflicts that emerged out of this and the gamemanship that went on behind the scenes to figure out the approach. And you say the two people who were friends have not spoken in 15 years. That's still the case.
Yeah, I think that after the book was published, I think one of them wrote an email to the other. But which was nice. I think that happened last April or May. But I think my sense is those bruises are still there.
And they voted. Then it was how long before they actually announced the vote? So there was some, I take it, nervousness on the part of all sides at that point.
Yeah, the argument was November 29th. The decision came out April 2nd. And the way the court works, no one knows what it's going to be. I mean, I now have a pretty good sense. I was delighted that I got to find out how many drafts there were, which I didn't know. But one of the justices I met with, Lily, opened up the file and started going through the drafts and showing me. Didn't let me take them with me, but showed me the drafts. And I discovered the Souter opinion. I didn't know there had been a separate opinion by David Souter in the case until there it was.
And what was the reaction among the environmental groups in the state of Massachusetts when the ruling came down?
Ecstatic. You know, everyone was ecstatic. They were shocked because the argument seemed to go well. It looked like they would not lose on standing, which was their biggest worry, and they looked to get a chance. But the most amazing thing is not only did they run the table. I'm going to stop sharing so people don't have to they can look at themselves now. And that is that it was the way Justice Stevens started his opinion. It was such a contrast the way it was litigated. The environmental groups in the states decided the best way to win this case was not to make it an environmental case. It was to make it sort of more of a technical administrative law case. That they made it some sort of radical environmental case, they thought they might scare away Justice Kennedy. So they made it a lawyer's case. And sometimes the best environmentalists are the best environmental lawyers are not the best environmentalists, they're the best lawyers. And they knew to win this case, they needed to make it a law case and not a case about how important climate change was. So they de-emphasized throughout their brief, throughout the argument, the climate aspect of it, because they thought that was the best way to win the case. But then, deliciously, when Justice Stevens wrote the opinion, he made it all about climate. His opening paragraph is all about climate. And he talks about what the respected scientists believe. And that is there's a correlation between human activity and climate change. That was what he wanted. He wanted to make this a big case about climate. It became almost a call to arms for legislation and regulatory action. So they didn't expect that. They were hoping they might win, but the way that he wrote the opinion was a true gift.
We want to get all your questions in. If you have them, forward them to Gretchen. Was this fun to write, to research, to produce?
Yeah, well, I love researching. And this was scorched earth research. I mean, I treated it like a Supreme Court brief. I had everyone's documents and jump drives. I had some people don't like the fact I got everything that I got. I had all the email traffic within parties. I had all the draft briefs. I talked to everyone, industry side, within the federal government, within the environmental groups, within the states, within the courts. One of my favorite on the record interviews was with a judge people probably haven't heard of, but he's one of the best judges of all, named David Tatel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He wrote a very powerful dissent in the lower court, which undoubtedly helped convince the Supreme Court to take the case. So that was only fun. I love researching. Writing's harder than researching. And for me, this is a very different kind of book that I've ever written before, because I wanted to write a book for a popular audience. And I had to find a voice for that. I had to make it about people, not about legal arguments. So it's very much focused on people and their lives. and their involvement in this case rather than about law in the first instance. And that was a harder voice to get, but I had some great help. And one thing I did, which was fun, is I hired a bunch of law students, but the law students did not do any research for me. They didn't do any writing for me. All I had to do was work on voice. Read draft chapters and tell me whether they thought it flowed and told a good story. And I hired law students who had written for their college newspapers. That was my touchstone, because I wanted people who had written to that kind of audience, and they did a great job. And we had a fun time.
You definitely found your voice. Let me ask you this: were you advising the environmental groups at all? Did you have a foot in both camps here? Was that a problem?
I certainly did. Most Supreme Court environmental cases, I'm advising the environmental side. I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is I'm one of the only ones who has a lot of Supreme Court experience, because I've argued cases and briefed on the case. The other thing is I'm free, and that's a nice combination. If you don't charge for your time. So most cases I do provide some help. This case was no exception to that. Not a major role, but a couple times I stepped in. They showed me a draft brief, and like most times I gave comments on it. I helped with the jurisdictional. The time I played my most significant role, but also behind the scenes, was when things completely broke down. Within the environmental team, they literally weren't speaking to each other at the oral argument fight. And the Mass AG, Jim Milkey, did a fabulous job. He came to me for sort of help. So I spent some time with him, coaching him before the argument. But here's the thing that I know. I've coached a lot of people, and you can coach them, but that doesn't mean they're going to do a good job. They got to do a good job on their own. Coaching is really helpful. When I was first doing Supreme Court arguments a long time ago, I remember I coached somebody from the Colorado AG's office when I was literally like 32 and arguing cases before the court. I coached someone and I told them exactly the questions, what I thought the answer should be, everything. They went up there and they did a terrible job. And I went back to one of my bosses in the Solicitor General's office, which is all the Supreme Court cases for the United States. I said, I just don't know. I can't. Why didn't he do a better job? Because he was a smart guy. He was a good guy. And he said, well, Supreme Court arguments is like Major League Baseball. Somebody could tell me exactly how to stand, exactly where to put the bat, how to swing, and they could teach me all of that. And someone gives me a major league pitch, I'm going to miss it every single time. You can't teach that. At some point, the person has to do it on their own. And so my hat's off to Jim Milton. It was one of the best arguments in the court I've seen. It was a very tough argument. And he was under enormous pressure. One, because of the conflict over who should argue the case. And another thing I didn't mention was about a week and a half before the argument, the other parts of the team had so lost confidence in him, they called him at home on a Saturday morning and told him to get off the case, that he was not competent to do it. And that was a call done by an old friend and colleague, former colleague of his. They called him and said, Jim, you've got to get off the case. And he was stunned. And he listened and he said, that's not going to happen. And the fact is, it was so to go up there and do a great job was fabulous. His first argument for the Supreme Court to do it. But I tell you, the conflict, as much as it was a ridiculous phone call to give, I get it. And that is, this was one of the biggest cases ever for the United States Supreme Court for environmental law. It involved climate change. And there were people who've been working on this issue for decades. And they were so worried that the case was going to tank, that they let that overwhelm, I think, their judgment.
And you say the Bush administration essentially stepped on it. They sort of took the bait. Did they blunder into this? And could they have done a better job in their arguments, do you think?
That's a great question, Brian, because that was one big surprise I had. I knew about the case itself. I didn't know all the backstory. Here's what happened. So this petition lands at EPA during the Bush administration. And actually, the then administrator of EPA was Christine Todd Whitman. She was a terrific administrator. She had taken the job as EPA administrator because she believed in the climate issue. George Bush had campaigned to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants during the 2000 election. He had gone to the left of Al Gore on climate. Bush had appointed, Colin Powell as Secretary of State. Colin Powell thought this was a pressing national security issue. Condoleezza Rice was National Security Advisor. She believed in it. And Bush had appointed as Secretary of Treasury Paul O'Neill. Paul O'Neill was the biggest climate hawk of them all. He felt so strongly about the climate issue that before the very first cabinet meeting of the Bush administration, he went to the White House before and placed in front of everyone's chair in the cabinet room a copy of his speech he had given a couple of years before, comparing the threat of climate change to the Holocaust. So there was every reason to think they were going to grant that petition and regulate. So what happened? Dick Cheney. And this is what I didn't know. Dick Cheney came in and he, without ever talking to Christine Todd Whitman or any of the others, he completely kneecapped them all. He was very effective inside player. He convinced Bush to renege on his campaign pledge. And not only did Bush renege on his campaign pledge, this happened within a few weeks of the new administration, without Christine Todd Whitman having one say in it, or anyone at EPA. He got Bush to sign a letter he sent to Congress which said, I'm not going to regulate greenhouse gases. And he said, there's no authority under the Clean Air Act to do it. So he got Bush to answer not just a policy question, but a legal question. So at that point, the administration had to deny the petition because they'd taken a position on it. If they hadn't done that, and that was because Cheney was very effective. He was not a lawyer, and they never consulted any lawyers, and they just made a mistake.
So if they had not done that and just let it lay there, what would have happened?
Probably absolutely nothing. Nothing. There would have been no action by the agency, nothing to challenge. There was nothing under the statute which forced EPA to act on this petition. The petition wasn't even filed under a particular provision of the law authorizing a petition to be filed. But they acted on it, and then they doubled down by denying the petition. And even then, the career lawyers at EPA, they had better suggestions of how to handle it for damage control. But the political appointees of the Bush administration, led by folks from the White House, they took a very much broader argument than they needed to support the denial of the petition. And then they lost that. And they created a Supreme Court case. So a lot of
great irony.
self-inflicted wounds.
Great irony. Hats off to Dick Cheney, right?
Yeah.
We want to get your questions in. Before we start to go to the questions, let me just ask you quickly on another topic. Your advice as part of the Biden transition team for the Justice Department. What did that involve, and how's he doing?
I think he's doing a great job. I mean, the transition was very gratifying public service. I was not a fan of the Trump administration, and I was certainly not a fan of the Trump Justice Department. It's a place where I myself worked for 8 years of my career, and I didn't like what was happening to the Justice Department. So to play any role in sort of transitioning to the next one was enormously rewarding to me. And to meet with the career people, one thing you do on the transition team is you meet with the career people. And you say, basically, the first thing you do when you meet with them is say, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for staying in your job. And we're going to put in new people, new political appointees, and they're going to respect you in your judgment. There'll be different administration priorities, but you're going to play the kind of role career people are supposed to play at the Justice Department, which is not to have the Justice Department be politicized by political appointees. So what we did was we met with career people. We worked on reports for every part of the division, every part of the department about what to do on January 20th, how to pivot litigation positions. There are about 100 cases, 100 regulations of the Trump administration, rollbacking environmental protections. So what to do about all those cases, how to put them on hold. And then the last thing we worked on was one of the most gratifying of all was the executive orders. So the executive orders, which came out on January 20th, 21st, 22nd, that first week, The content of the executive orders was decided not by us. That's done by the president and his campaign promises, but how to actually write them and make them work is something we played a role in from the DOJ.
Absolutely fascinating. Let's throw it open to questions. So we have some. Gretchen, who's on?
We do have some questions. Steve and Rhonda ask, were the dissenters really concerned with standing, or were they climate change deniers, or both?
Yeah, I don't think, it's hard to, I don't think any of them were climate change deniers. I think I might say that Justice Scalia was a climate change skeptic. I don't know if he was a denier, but he certainly was quite skeptical, and that became clear. He was skeptical back then of whether human activity played a role in it, and that came through in his questioning. I think that people like the Chief Justice was mostly concerned about standing, Article 3 standing. It's a very important issue to him. It always has been since he was a young lawyer. So I think he thought the court shouldn't hear this kind of case because the cause and effect was too amorphous to make it a concrete imminent injury. The vote, though, was 5-4 on both issues. And that surprised me. I thought the standing issue was a close question. I thought we had the better argument. I thought it would be 5-4, we'd win or lose, and happily won. I thought the question whether greenhouse gases are air pollutants or not, with the meaning of the statute, I thought that was a no-brainer. I thought that should have been 9-0. So I can't say I really understand why that part of the case was 5-4. It should have been 9-0. There was another administrative law question in the case, which is a little bit nuanced for the current context. On that one, actually, I thought the other side had the better argument, but we managed to win that one 5-4 too.
Let me follow up by asking you if that case was argued before today's Supreme Court, what would the vote be?
Yeah, if it was argued before the court today, in the first instance, had been decided before. If it was argued before the court today, I think they'd lose on standing. I very little doubt they lose on standing, and they might have lost on the other issue as well, the greenhouse gas air pollutants. That was a tougher one because there was a very, very strong textual argument. So someone like Gorsuch might well have voted with the environmental groups there, and I don't know enough about Justice Barrett to know. I know Thomas and Alito wouldn't because they didn't. I'm pretty sure Kavanaugh wouldn't because based on his kinds of things he wrote in the DC Circuit, and the chief wouldn't have because he didn't before. But I don't know about Gorsuch. I think Gorsuch might have been a gettable vote. But on the standing issue, I think we lose right now. Now that doesn't mean that the court's going to overrule Mass versus EPA because a case was decided in 2007. And the court doesn't just overrule every case they think was wrongly decided. Actually, I think Massachusetts versus EPA is fairly secure right now. I don't think it'll be overruled. I do worry about it being eroded, though. I think that's possible.
Any other questions, Gretchen?
Yes, we have a few more. What is the atmosphere like to be in the court during an argument like this, as an attorney and as a spectator?
Well, I mean, I can speak from both perspectives. I'll do this as an attorney. When you stand at the lectern before the justices, and I have a chapter title called 74 inches, because that's how far you are away from the Chief Justice, 74 inches. That's pretty close. You could lean over the lectern, reach out. He could lean over, reach out, and you could actually touch hands. I know no other court where you're as close to the bench as the United States Supreme Court. And you juxtapose that with the fact that you're in this unbelievably grand room. So it's a combination of grandeur and intimacy at the same time. And the bench doesn't go straight across, it wraps. So it literally wraps around you a little bit. So it's this intimate conversation with 9 justices in this incredible setting. And what's amazing about it and the opportunity, why there's so much at stake, is when the justices meet in oral argument, it is by tradition the first time they speak to each other about what they think about a case. They have not previously met and deliberated about the case or discussed it, as what they say. They haven't really discussed it. So when they sit down at their chairs and you're standing there, and you're answering their questions. You're learning what they think, and the colleagues on the bench are learning what the justices think at the same time. So it basically means that you get a chance to participate in their conversation. For the first time, to learn each other's views. That's quite an opportunity. And every question is this amazing opening of what they're thinking and how you can try to work to get to 5. That's why the book is called The Rule of 5. You're trying to get to 5 justices. One interesting little tick about the court, which is a challenge to advocates, is just a practical matter, is because you're so close, you actually can't see them all 9 at the same time. You have to sort of keep your head turning a little bit. And because they speak in microphones right in front of them, you don't hear their voice from where they are. You hear their voice from speakers up above. So that means when a justice asks you a question, you have no audio cue or visual cue of who's asking you the question. So it's not at all unusual, and you think you would because you're so close. It's not unusual to see new advocates before the court get asked a question. You see them kind of looking around, trying to figure out who asked the question. Sometimes justice will kind of go, over here. So the seasoned advocates learn the voices. They learn the voices, so when they hear the voice, they know where to look. And the other thing they do is they know the visual cue you will get. And that is before a justice asks a question, they have to lean forward a little bit and push a button on the microphone. So you're constantly scanning to look for who's about to ask you a question. And that's fun. The whole thing is fun. I can tell you, your first argument is not as much fun as the later arguments, because the first one, you're just worried about survival. One is, I remember my very first argument before the court, I got asked a question by Justice Blackmun. He said, "What is a proceeding?" That was his question. It was about the meaning of 42 U.S.C. 1988, which involves the word proceeding. And I remember Justice Blackmun asked me that question, what is a proceeding? And I can tell you exactly what was in my head, which I hope I didn't show, which is, wow, that's Justice Blackmun. He's asking me a question. I mean, I was so excited to be asked a question by Justice Blackmun. I mean, it's a pretty fun experience. The other thing I'll say about the court, and Steve Wermiel, who is a fabulous scholar of the Supreme Court, knows this, is that they're very well prepared. I don't always like how they vote in cases, but it's a pleasure to appear before prepared judges, and they're very well prepared, and they're very good lawyers, and they ask tough questions, and you do have the sense that they've really thought things through. They are more conservative than I wish they were, but I've got a lot of respect for the justices in the court.
Richard, how old were you when you argued your first case before the court?
Let's see, it would have been in 1986, so I was 32.
That's one of the youngest ever, right?
No, there could be some younger tykes. It's pretty young, but there'll be people who are not much younger, but there'll be people who are younger than
Did
that.
you sweat through your shirt that day?
I think I did. One great thing is I was in the Solicitor General's office when I did the argument, and in the Solicitor General's office, you wear a morning coat. No one else wears a morning coat but people from the Solicitor General's office. And so I got to wear a morning coat, which was, added pleasure. And I'll also say it's special to argue for the United States. And to stand up there and say you represent the United States was particularly thrilling for me.
Let's get to some more questions, Gretchen.
Okay, we have one. Why has the climate change issue become so politicized? Why are people in the US willing to bet that the science is wrong?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most unfortunate things that happened, that it became so politicized. It really didn't have to be. A few things led to that. One, environmental law became very politicized in the 1990s. Before that, the legislation which passed Congress was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities of both Democrats and Republicans through the 1970s and 1980s. It was really a bipartisan project. In the 1990s, the Contract with America sort of targeted environmental law as more of a Democrat issue. So that began the partisanship of environmental law. And that's one reason why we have not had a significant environmental law passed by Congress since 1990. Complete logjam in Congress on these issues. And that is just the sort of paralyzing effect of partisanship in environmental law. The climate issue is tougher still because there were a lot of reason to believe it was not going to be so partisan. John McCain in the early 2000s was the first one to hold a series of highly publicized hearings on climate change in 2000. He was a climate change hawk on it. George Bush, as I mentioned, Christine Todd Whitman were leaders on these issues. Even in 2009, Lindsey Graham and McCain together were supporters of aggressive climate legislation. Newt Gingrich, around that time, did an ad on television with Nancy Pelosi about how they disagree about many things, but the one thing they agreed on was the need to address the climate issue. So as recent as 2009, there were Democrats and Republicans seeming consensus to address this issue. And that ended in 2010. The Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party in the 2010 midterm elections, they targeted the climate issue. They targeted the climate issue as hurting Americans, as raising electricity rates, as ceding our sovereignty to other countries, any kind of international treaty. And at that point, the climate issue became completely polarized. But it wasn't before then. I'll give you one interesting stat on that. Barack Obama mentioned the words climate change or global warming about 80 times in 2009, 80 times in 2010. In 2011, he mentioned it like under 5 times. And then in 2012, he didn't mention the words again until he secured the Democratic nomination and won the presidency. It became clear it was too sensitive a political issue. And then once he became reelected, he went for it again. But it became a polarizing issue for middle America. And until we overcome that, we're hard pressed to get the progress we need.
Let me just follow up. How does Joe Biden overcome that then?
Well, I mean, what Biden is doing, I think he's doing it very smartly. He's trying to make sure this is all about jobs. Addressing climate change is all about jobs. It's because the one thing I think environmental groups have not done well, I think Joe Biden will do well, is environmental groups, they're pushing very hard for this regulation, these restrictions. They weren't paying as much attention as one needs to the people who get hurt by the transition. For moving from one kind of fuel to another kind of fuel, moving away from coal. We have to move away from coal. We have to be more concerned about natural gas over time. But there are communities and people who suffer tremendously from those shifts. And you need to attend to their needs. You need to attend to their needs at the same time and pay attention to those communities. And I think Biden is planning to combine that much more effectively than anyone has done before. If he doesn't, he won't succeed.
Gretchen, any more questions, or are we just about out of time?
We're just about out. I had one quick question. You addressed it a little bit. I read that you were the founder of something called the Supreme Court Institute, I believe, and you train lawyers before they argue their case. Can you talk about, how long does that take? How do you, I never thought about that. It's like boot camp for, learning how to do that.
Right. Well, when I was in the Georgetown Law faculty, I created something called the Supreme Court Institute. And we did no less than create a mock Supreme Court room at Georgetown, which has the same carpet, the same clock behind it, not a bench as big, but the same kind of bench for 5 rather than 9. And we offered it on a complete pro bono basis for any attorney who's got a case before the United States Supreme Court. We do one side, first come, first serve, for free. And we bring in the best Supreme Court advocates in the country for free. They volunteer their time to prepare an attorney. And so attorneys come in usually 3 to 5 days before their argument, and they get a complete grilling You can't do it. I mean, usually it's 5 days because you want to tear them apart, and they have enough time to put themselves back together again. And everyone wants to do it, from new lawyers to the most seasoned Supreme Court advocates do it. Chief Justice Roberts, when he was a Supreme Court advocate, would always go to Georgetown and do it ahead of time. And one nice thing about it is, since it's known to be first come, first served, nonpartisan, everyone's willing to volunteer to be a justice to help as an officer of the court. So if we were mooting a side that was liberal, we'd have conservatives as the justices. If we had someone mooting who was conservative, we'd have liberals. We'd always flip it, because that way they get real questions. The mistake that is often done in these moots is they have people who believe in the position serving as justices, and they're cheerleaders. You don't need cheerleaders. You need skeptics. And I think the justices themselves appreciate it, because it's improved the quality of the advocacy before the court, I think, considerably. My last argument a few years ago, I was destroyed by the moot court. Destroyed. They ripped me apart. And I felt like, wait a second, I created this thing. You can't do that. And it helped me. I changed one aspect of my argument a lot, not a lot of it, but one part, and it made a big difference at the actual argument.
Well, absolutely fascinating. And your book is a great read. It is that you cannot put it down, really. It is John Grisham without the sex and the murders. Professor Richard Lazarus, thank you so much. It's the Rule of Five, Making Climate History at the Supreme Court. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts tonight with our great Sharon Library members and followers.
Well, I look forward to seeing the library in person too. I look forward to that time. It'll be really fun.
We can have an in-person event someday to look forward to.
All right, well, take care. Brian, great to see you again, and Holly and Gretchen to meet you, and Steve and Rhonda, as always. All right.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Brian. If I just want to mention, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, we have some at the library. So just call us or email us tomorrow, and we'll have some signed book plates that you can receive with your copy of the book. And we have 2 events coming up in March. On March 18th, we're part of a group of libraries that is hosting Dr. Bernard Lafayette, one of the last living freedom riders. He will be with us on Thursday, March 18th. And on March 25th, Brian will be back to talk with Ira Rosen, the author of Ticking Clock, Behind the Scenes at 60 Minutes. So we have lots of great events planned into the spring. So keep an eye out for our email, newsletter, and check our website frequently. So thank you all.